Tree identification is one of those really useful skills to keep in your back pocket whenever you're out hiking in the woods, going through a public park, or honestly, anywhere trees can be found. For myself, I never really realized the value of being able to identify trees until I learned how to identify them. So many of you can probably identify a lot of trees from those green leaves in the summer, but when winter comes and colder temperatures move in, all those leaves fall to the ground. And then what? So today on NEDTALKS, we're going to talk about how to identify trees during the winter, some things that might be useful to help you in identifying trees, and then we're going to look at a couple common trees of Pennsylvania to identify. Welcome to NEDTALKS. So when you're looking to identify trees in the winter, the first place you want to start is with the arrangement of the leaves or buds on a twig. Just like during the summer, we have opposite, alternate, or whorled. So an opposite arrangement, like on this maple twig here, means that the buds or twigs are going to come off opposite of each other on the branch. Whereas an alternate arrangement means those buds or twigs are going to come off alternately going up the branch, just like on this birch twig. Now, an easy way to remember the arrangement of different trees is to remember the acronym MAD-HORSE. So maples, ashes, dogwoods, and horse chestnut or buckeye are typically the only trees that have an opposite arrangement, MAD-HORSE. And of course there are some exceptions, but you shouldn't run into too many of them, and you can look them up where they come along. Now the second thing you're going to want to look at with your trees to identify them in the winter is going to be the bark. So we have this mystery tree right here, and if we look at the bark, we'll notice it's very, very smooth. There's not a lot of fissures or breaking up in the bark, but there is a little bit of flakiness to the bark too. And if we look really close at the bark, we'll notice there's a bunch of little horizontal checks or lines across the bark. Those are called lenticels. And those lenticels are places where gas exchange occurs in the tree. And they can be a really useful thing to be able to identify a tree with. Now, to contrast the bark we just looked at, if we look at this tree, we'll notice that there's some fissures going down the bark. The bark looks a little bit wavy and platy and maybe a little bit peeling. Overall, a lot rougher than the other bark we looked at. Now the third thing you want to look at when you're trying to identify a tree in the winter is you want to look really closely at those buds on the twigs. So you've already determined the arrangement at this point. That hopefully narrowed down your search of what species you have. Now if you look really closely at the buds on the twig, every tree has completely different buds, and they've got unique characteristics to them that can help you identify the tree. So for instance, are those buds long and pointy, or are they blunt and short? Are they red? Are they tan? Are they multicolored? Do those buds have hair on them? Are they covered in scales, or is it just kind of one big bud scale covering, or don't they have any scales? What's the color of the twig that the buds are on? All of these things can be useful to help you kind of parse out and figure out which tree you have. Learning the characteristics of different types of bark on different types of trees is immensely important for winter ID, and it's not as hard as it seems once you start to look at a couple trees or get a really good feel of what certain trees look like. It becomes pretty easy. And I do actually have a book recommendation here too, Bark, a field guide to trees of the Northeast. And this book is a really good reference guide to a lot of trees you'll find around in Pennsylvania. It has, I would say, most of them in here. And it's got some very nice visuals, and it gives you the ability to kind of study a little bit when you can't always get out in the field. All right, so now that we've gone through arrangement, bark, and buds, it's time to look at some common Pennsylvania trees. I'll show you how to identify them in the winter, why they are what they are, just as an example of kind of how you want to go through identifying a tree. So first of all, I've got this small tree right beside me here. And the first thing I'm going to notice about this tree is that bark. So it's got some very shallow fissures running down the side, kind of thin little pieces running all the way up along the side, but otherwise it's pretty smooth. And I'll notice that in between the fissures, it's kind of white. I kind of like to describe tulip poplar as powdered sugar in between the fissures in the bark. So that's useful to look at. It's pretty unique to tulip poplar. And so I'm going to look at the arrangement of this sapling, and what I notice is that those buds and twigs are alternate. They're alternating back and forth. So tulip poplar is an alternate tree, so that makes sense. The next thing I'm going to look at is these buds, and tulip poplar has what we call bivalve or valvate buds. So those buds don't have any bud scales on them that are kind of overlapping around each other like a lot of trees. Instead, they're covered in two bud scales that kind of come together like an oyster shell, making a valve. So after seeing so much tulip poplar before and looking in my bark book and other tree ID guides, I'm pretty confident that this is tulip poplar, but there's one last extra thing I can check just to be sure. We didn't talk about this, but a little bonus. So it's always really handy to carry a pocket knife with you when you're in the woods, especially if you're IDing trees, because what we're going to do is we are going to take a twig off of this tulip poplar, and if you smell it, it smells very citrusy, so that is something tulip poplar is known for, and that is my confirmation on ID. So we have tulip poplar. So next up, another common species of tree in Pennsylvania forests is going to be black birch beside me here, this little sapling. So running through the ID for black birch, the first thing is there's a twig pretty close to the ground here that's accessible, so I'm going to look at the twig in the buds. So I notice that it is alternate with those buds going back and forth, and if I look at those buds pretty closely, they look kind of like an elongated football. They're kind of pointy and sort of round. They're also green with brown towards the edges of those overlapping scales. So that is a characteristic of black birch buds. And now if I look at the bark, what I'll notice as well is it's pretty smooth. That's pretty typical for young trees. And there's a bunch of horizontal lenticels across, making those check marks horizontally going all the way up the tree. On older trees, that bark is going to start to split and crack. There will be big plates that still have those horizontal lenticels across though, so be sure to look for them. Now, another thing that's going to help us here with the birch is to notice that as you go up the tree on older branches, those buds are stalked and they're going to create little spurs along the branch. So they're not actually twigs coming out, it's a big stalk and then the buds on the end. So if you look up into the tree and you see those spurs, that's a good indication that will narrow down your ID. And then lastly, you can pull out that knife again, or you can just rip a piece of twig and smell it, and black birch will have a very strong wintergreen odor, so it's going to smell like wintergreen mint. So next up we have red maple, the most predominant tree in forests in the United States. So this one can be a tricky one if you're not familiar with identifying red maple, because you can have two trees standing beside each other that look completely different. So this is where you really want to pay attention to those different things that you're looking for when you're IDing the trees. The first, predominantly what's going to tell you that it's a maple is that it is opposite, mad horse. Remember, maple's the first one there. So I noticed there's a sprout coming out the bottom of the tree here. I'm going to look at the arrangement and it is opposite. So that tells me it's either a maple, ash, dogwood, or a buckeye. The next thing I'm going to look at is that bark. Now, red maple is a tricky one because it can have completely different bark on different trees. So I'll notice that it's kind of shaggy and peeling down at the bottom. As you go up, it is smoother, and then there's kind of patches everywhere of different types of patterns. There's some shagginess, some splitting, and then it's smooth again. It looks like maybe some spots on the tree. As you go up, it gets smooth. So red maple has very, very variable bark. So you want to remember that there's lots of different things going on red maple. So that kind of patchwork looking bark that just doesn't really fit in with anything, that's a dead giveaway to me that that's a red maple. And you'll get that too as you learn the trees a little bit more. But to be sure too, if you can get a twig, you can check out those buds. They're kind of small and round. Again, they're opposite. They're going to be red. They have overlapping scales. And the twig that the bud's on, often that end of the twig is going to be red too, which is characteristic of red maple. All right, so the last tree we'll look at today and run through the ID on is another super common one, a red oak. So beside me here, this big guy is a red oak. The first thing I'm gonna notice is there's no twigs near the ground for me to look at, so I'll start with the bark. Now if I look at the bark, this is very uneven. It's not very smooth at all. There's some deep, wide furrows, and if I start looking up the bark more, what I'll notice is all those ridges on the bark kind of have a flat top to them that are a little bit shiny. So if you look at the bark of a red oak, it almost looks like ski trails going down the bark. And on a red oak, those ski trails go from the crown to the ground. So if you stand back and look at the tree, it's pretty obvious. So next, the trick we didn't quite talk about either is it's actually pretty useful to carry a pair of binoculars with you when you're identifying trees. Because in a situation like this, where we don't have any twigs near the ground to look at, we can actually use our binoculars to look up into the canopy, and we can determine the arrangement from there. And when practicing your winter tree ID, you'll find pretty quickly that oaks have clusters of buds on the tips of their branches. So now that we've covered how to identify a tree in the winter, went through what to look for, and looked at a couple of trees and kind of went through that ID together, hopefully you're all ready to get out and start learning and identifying some trees for yourself. Again, it can be really intimidating at first, but once you start looking at trees and learning what to look for, it can actually be pretty easy to identify trees in the winter. Another resource I would like to recommend is a good tree guide too. And this is another really good reference guide that you can use year-round. With that being said, get outside, take a look at some trees, appreciate the small things, and happy IDing.